So welcome everybody to Crisis and Business Continuity once again. I believe last week we were looking at normal accident theories, and also we tried to explore high reliability organization theory. And one of the things I mentioned was that both theories were actually complementary to each other. And today we'll be looking at something much more. I promised last week we'll be going to be looking at organizational resilience. So the key one of the key standards around the concept of organizational resilience is the British standard 65,000. And of course, I will refer you to that particular standard because it set the page best practices relating to organizational resilience within the field. But today, one of the learning outcome at the end of these particular shorter presentations, you should be able to analyze, looking at maybe global risk events and look at the impact on business performance. And of course, we will try to get you to understand what organizational resilience is and explain the different models of organizational resilience. So that will be the center of my attention. Of course, we start to look at some of the ways organizations can actually utilize effective maybe resilience practices, for example, to mitigate crisis situations. So this will be the center of what I'm trying to cover today. So without much ado, last year, I think that with the outbreak of COVID-19, one of the early articles that was published in New York Times on the 13th of February, to be precise, in 2020, look at the impact of the coronavirus outbreak on the world economy. And one of the reference was to companies like maybe Starbucks, for example, and also maybe FedEx and other companies that depend heavily on supply chain from especially China. For example, the pandemic has really exposed weaknesses in many of these businesses practices. So one of the things that was really highlighted in that particular paper article was the concept of organizational resilience in terms of how businesses need to think more carefully how they can really adapt and put up some practices in place that can help them to recover and come back to normality in the event of a crisis event. So, and then of course, we also know that obviously, like you have global risk events that affect organizational performance, and one of the key highlights of that is the global risk index that is usually published by World Bank. And in that report, they highlight quite a range of areas like economy. They highlighted environmental, they look at technology, they look at political, they look at other societal issues that the pandemic and risk event can have on organization, because as you know, it's not just one side of an organization. They can have a dramatic impact when a crisis to happen. It can have a ripple effect on the economy as well, because if companies are not performing well because of crisis, they can lay off staff, and that can create unemployment situations, and obviously that can create a further societal problems as well. So businesses need to think more carefully in terms of how they recover basically from crisis, how they plan for crisis. And in the global risk index that was put forward by World Bank, they try to look at the likelihood of some of the events that can happen. They look at top 10 risks, and then they also look at top 10 risks also in terms of impact for 2020. And we saw things like extreme weather, we saw climate change, climate change action failures. They look at natural disasters. They also look at human-made environmental disasters. They look at data fraud or theft, cyber attacks. They look at water crisis and global governance failures as well. And of course, they also look at asset bubbles as well. These are the top 10 risks that was identified in that particular event, in that particular study. And also in terms of impact, I think climate action failures was listed top in that particular list. They look at the use of weapons of mass destruction. They look at biodiversity loss in extreme weather, water crisis, and other things relating to issues such as natural disasters and cyber attack. And one of the things that this is really useful to think about is areas in which businesses can actually think and plan much more carefully in terms of their mitigations, or areas in which they can help their businesses to adapt to the crisis. So I will refer you to that particular studies. So you can start to look at the way global risk functions and in fact affect business level. So they've looked at if there are certain problems that are in existence that businesses are not able to cope, that can have a dramatic impact on the reputation of the business, and business confidence level can be reduced, and therefore maybe investors are likely to hold back, and of course we know the impact that can have on the GDP of an economy. And of course the World Bank and the OECD also did a projection in terms of the impact possible global risk factors can have on business. And one of the key insight from that is that as crisis events and risk tends to increase, business performance tends to decrease. The reason being that a lot of companies are not really well prepared to deal with the outcome. So the question then is, what is resilience and why does it matter? So resilience is linked to ability of a system to return to stable state after a disruptive condition. So that is one of the key things that resilience was linked to, being able to return back to normal after a period of disruption. Also, we know that resilience is also seen as the magnitude of disturbance the system or an organization can actually tolerate and still persist. So that's another way to look at resilience. The other ways to look at it is to see it as the ability to go on with life or to continue living a purposeful life after hardship or adversity, after crisis, we still carry on living. So resilience is not just applicable at organizational level, you can also look at it at individual level as well. So, but what is organizational resilience then? So, organizational resilience in the study that we conducted in 2015 to be precise, we'll look at it as ability of an organization to actually respond quickly, recover fast, or develop unusual ways of doing business under pressure, under crisis, developing a new way, fast way, a quick way of doing business. And of course, it is also seen as the capacity of or the robustness of organization under condition of adversity, under condition of crisis. How can businesses actually respond? How can businesses manage to adapt and recover quickly in the event of a crisis? These are the heart of what makes organization. These are the heart of what constitute resilient organization. So we know it helps the our organizations being able to absorb possible impact of crisis on the performance of the organizations, on the operations of the organizations as well. So there are different definitions of resilience as I pointed out, and of course other studies point out to the issue of the ability to quickly recognize and seize opportunities in events of a crisis and manage change, and of course avoid possible collisions that can have a dramatic impact on the survival, on the business continuity of that particular organization. So these are some of the ways to think about organizational resilience in within the context of existing literatures that have been put out there. But of course there are definitions of resilience as there are different school of thought, because a number of these definitions are informed by the school of thought, by the field in which these studies have actually been conducted. That is something to think, to bear in mind. The thinking point for you is, what conclusions can we actually draw from the definitions that are presented? What can you make of? Can you think of a way to define a simple way to define resilience within the context of your own organization? Because I believe that every organization needs to very carefully define what resilience will mean for them. And of course that's why at the onset I refer you to the British Standard 65,000 on organizational resilience, which is a global best practices relating to organizational resilience. So think about what definitions can you come up with a definition of resilience, of organizational resilience, given what I've said so far. So that being said, so what typical risk strategies can we adopt then to build organizational resilience, to help businesses to develop that crucial resilience that is needed? What are the strategies we can adapt? And one way to think about this is to look at business continuity. Can be part of those strategy. that we can adapt to help businesses to recover quickly if there's a crisis to mitigate the impact. We can also start to think more carefully in terms of risk management as well. We can also look at crisis management if business continuity when plans don't go as it ought to go and a crisis do happen. What then do we do? What are the mitigating factors? What are the measures we can put in place? So that's another third point we can start to look at. The other thing is to look at disaster recovery as well, to help businesses to come back to the pre-loss before the disaster, before the crisis, before the disruptions. So collectively, these four broad areas can help businesses to think carefully, putting up a resilience enterprise program together, and that can lead to organizational resilience. And that's one way to think about this. The other way to think about this is that some of the antecedents that have been put forward in literatures include things like anticipation. So to what extent is your organization able to anticipate possible areas the businesses is likely to be vulnerable to crisis, to disaster, to disruption? The other thing is once you then do that, and you can also integrate things like business impact analysis. Once you've done the anticipation aspect, you can look at assessment, where you are assessing the possible impact. And of course, you're putting up prevention measures in place to deal with the outcome. And of course, all these involve a lot of preparations. And if a crisis do happen, you need to respond as well. So that's another aspect. And then, of course, you can then be looking at recovery. So these are six broader areas. You can also start to think about some of the antecedents that can help businesses to adapt, to recover very quickly from disruptions and possible crises on the organization. So the 6 points I've mentioned here is anticipation, I've mentioned assessment, I've looked at preventions, and of course I've also looked at what is also called preparations, response, and recovery. So that is the key things that I've looked at here. So that being said, so I was explaining that the key 6 point that I've mentioned here can really help businesses to recover, to manage to prepare, to help them to be able to recover if there's any sort of crisis or disruption that have a dramatic impact on the businesses. So the point again is the anticipations. You're looking at anticipation, assessment. You're looking at preventions, preparations, and of course response and recovery. To help collectively can help businesses to look at ways to deal with the outcome of a crisis or disruptions on the organization. So these are areas as a risk manager, as a crisis manager, you can help businesses to think very carefully about. And of course, these particular I find this particular point as well really important when how does the organizational resilience tensions quadrant, for example, explain resilience. So these ones, I believe, for example, you can start to look at. Obviously, we mentioned resilience being the ability of organization to anticipate, to prepare for and respond to possible crises, and then being able to adapt at the same time. And of course that adaptation can take in form of maybe a response to things like maybe incremental change or disruptive change, things like maybe sudden change like crisis or disasters. So businesses being able to adapt to those, and you can start to look at maybe the progressive aspect or the flexibilities and all the responsive aspect and the consistent aspect. So businesses need to be able to deal very carefully with some of these areas in terms of helping those businesses to thrive, to survive, and manage the outcome of incident on the organizations. So this is about me just trying to wrap it up at this stage, because I don't want to bore you too much with a lot of the literatures around this, but I will encourage you to kind of go back and pick up some of those studies that we put up on your Blackboard and read around this. So there are different dimensions that are needed to build organizational resilience. Already I've mentioned some of those. And one of the things that I want to really highlight is the 4 areas. For example, you can look at operational resilience. You can obviously, when you're looking at operational risks that can have maybe supply chain, for example, it could be a bigger issue that can fall under the operational risks. For example, especially with COVID, we're seeing some of these impact and the dramatic issues that this can have on organization as well. So businesses need to be able to develop operational capability to deal with this. We also know that capital could be another factors that businesses, capital resilience businesses needs to be able to put up some build up enough capital structures, build up enough mitigation plans in place to make sure that their capital is not being eroded. So that's another ways that businesses need to think very carefully. And of course, you can start to also look at market resilience as well. The market in which the organization is operating, you should be able to recognize the risks within the market, and of course, try to look at ways in which that businesses can help to continue to serve the customers, and of course continue to attract, create values, and also capture values, and as well as making money from the markets. And another ways is also to look at the stakeholders resilience. So when you're looking at stakeholder resilience as well, you want to make sure that you're able to adapt, you're able to identify possible areas that your stakeholders can be affected, and how obviously if you depend too much on them, that can obviously have an impact on the operation. Take for a typical example, businesses like Starbucks, for example, that was reported in the New York Times articles that was written last year, or precisely in February last year, looking at companies that depend on supply from China, for example. These are stakeholders to those businesses, and if these businesses are disrupted by the pandemic, obviously this can have a dramatic impact, of course, on their operations and their bottom line as well, relating to the profitability of this business. So that being said, so there are different indicators. Of course, you can pick these up. So there are a lot of things that needs to happen. So resilience is not a one size fits all, but there are a wide range of indicators that can help businesses to develop that needed resilience. And some of those indicators within organizational context are things relating to situation awareness, things relating to innovations and creativities in the business itself, things relating to testing and planning, and of course you're looking at business impact analysis, you're looking at your planning strategies, you could be looking at maybe leadership, for example. These are some areas like decision makings. They all collectively they all help businesses to develop the needed resilience within the organization. So there are areas there. These are some of the indicators, obviously, that have been pointed out in the literatures that have been just been aggregated within this particular slide to kind of show you that this is not a one-off exercise. So I think your task as a risk manager, as a business manager within an organization, is to help your businesses to be able to thrive and to be able to survive despite the presence of crisis. That's one way to think about this. So what are the typical risk strategies that we can adopt to build resilience? We mentioned four things here. Number one is to identify possible risks in which that can have an impact on the organizations, and you can do, and then two is to consider the impact. A business impact analysis will be helpful in this particular area. And one, of course, when you're looking at risk identification, identifying the impact of identified risks, for example, things like bow tie that we discussed previously in these particular modules can help to identify risks. And of course, you're looking at, secondly, I've talked about consider the impact, and of course develop contingency plans, contingency measures in place as well to deal with the impact, and of course exercise and test the plan. So these are four strategies, typical risk strategies that we can adopt to build resilience within organizations. So one, the impact, consider the risks. Two, you identify you consider the impacts and the areas where the businesses may be vulnerable. Three, you develop contingency measures and plans in place, and of course do an exercise and test that particular plans, and to make sure that you're in the right track. So which organizational resilience models will you use to address specific known threats? So this is something for you to kind of go back and kind of reflect on. Which of the resilience models are you going to use? Say, for example, if you list maybe 5 threats based on the global risk report, for example, and then you try to look at appropriate measures that have been put in place to deal with the impact of this particular risk to the organization. So you'll be looking at the measurements in terms of operational resilience. You'll be looking at maybe market resilience. You'll be looking at maybe capital resilience, for example, or stakeholder resilience as well, because collectively these different dimensions can have an impact on the organizations. And resilience needs to be something not just that is considered in isolation of every other thing that happens within the organization. So next week, I'm very pleased that we'll be looking at business continuity planning. And one of the things that we'll be specifically talking about is still building up on what we've looked at today, is when plans fail, what do we do? So we'll be looking at that. And I hope that you will join me. Now, of course, we're going to conclude the other part of these lectures on organizational resiliences as well. And once we've done that, and I believe that we'll also be looking at crisis communications, and also we'll be looking at how to handle the media in the event of crisis. And of course, we'll also be looking at maybe crisis-prone organizations, and what are some of the features of a crisis-prone organizations as well. So that will be the key things that we'll be looking at next week. So, but thank you so much for joining me today, and of course, I'm going to see you next week, where we'll be discussing this aspect of the model relating to business continuity planning too. And I look forward to you joining us at that time. So thank you.